for being here live. This is the first of the coffees with Miss Cook. I got 3 of these scheduled once a month over the next couple of months, but if we're finding them useful, we can keep going into the end of the school year. I started these last year, obviously when we were all in shelter in place, because it was just impossible to interface with parents. And so it felt like, let's get together periodically and just answer some questions en masse. Felt important to keep that going this year, both because, you still can't get in the building to meet with me. And I do think it can be a pretty effective way to hear other people's questions and whatnot, not be feeling like you're, doing this in a vacuum. And it might save some emails just back and forth between us, if you're able to get things, questions answered in one fell swoop. So I'm going to ask folks to just stay on mute here up at the top. Typically what I'm going to do is start these with a couple of updates or, things that have been happening, reminders, and then open up the bulk of the time just for us to talk. And so if you have questions you want to ask live, if you want to put them in the chat, either way, whatever works for you, camera on, camera off, it's up to you. This is meant to just be sort of a casual situation. But I'll just remind you that we are recording, and I will always push out the recordings of these whenever Mr. McDonald gets it on YouTube, which is sometimes within 24 hours, sometimes it takes the weekend. But I do always send it out to the whole class, so you've got it. And there is a college advising playlist or channel or something on JCHS's YouTube page as well. So you want to go revisit the junior college night, you can definitely check it out there. So I think that's the housekeeping stuff. Oh, and I try to keep these to an hour, more than that. And I know we all just get tuned out. It's Zoom. It's, a little annoying to be back here. So we will always stop at 9 a.m. unless y'all run out of questions and we're done earlier. But if you can't stay the whole time, no big deal. Again, there'll be a recording. So just a little bit about what's been happening at school in terms of college advising. I have met with most of the junior class at this point. I think I've got 10 or 12 kids left to go. So if I haven't met with your child yet, know that it's coming. I've got 3 of them today. So I really try and wrap these up by the end of January. And these are ranging from half an hour to an hour, depending on how verbal your child is, really. And we are talking about their questionnaires and the information they told me, but I often have follow-up questions. So obviously just trying to get to know them or get to know them better if we've already had some contact with one another. And we get into their college preferences a little bit, knowing, for me anyways, that this is their preferences at the moment, right? And their sort of gut instincts about what they want. I often hear, for example, at this moment, students saying like, yeah, I think I might want to stay closer to home, stay on the West Coast. And then over the next few months, they might get a little bit more adventurous or broaden their scope a little bit. So I take note of what they're thinking now, but know that that can certainly evolve. We are talking a bit about testing, and I love that we're at a moment where we can make some empowered decisions around that. So I know that some students will not be pursuing testing, many will, and anyone who's testing, will still have a moment next fall about, well, do we submit these or not, and who might be requiring them. I think that's still going to be a very small minority of colleges, and then where do we really have the choice and what's going to put their best foot forward. And we're talking about teacher recommendations, just doing a little brainstorming about who might be good candidates for them to make a request at the end of the school year. So no requests are being made yet, but it's helpful. Some students have a laundry list of people they're thinking about, and we sort of talk about, who might be the best ones to select. And other folks are a little stuck thinking about, maybe more than 1 or 2 people. And so this is also to help them have this more front of mind over the next few months and be thinking about those relationships and how they're doing in their classes and all the rest, so that they're poised to make some requests and have those be met positively at the end of the year. What else? At the end of the meetings, I am telling them a little college advising homework. If this is not translating at home to you, I'll just let you know sort of what that is, but I am encouraging them to book at least 1 test sitting where applicable, if they are pursuing testing. Even if we're talking about May or June dates, July, I think the ACT has, because sittings are booking up. There is this pent up demand from the COVID sort of restrictions and cancellations and all the rest. So get yourself a spot reserved, even if it's on down the road, and then you can kind of backfill that time thinking about any kind of prep or planning practice you might do. And then know that dates for next year, which start with August for the SAT, those registrations typically don't open up until June or July. So, I'll send reminders about when that's coming, but try and book at least one test sitting if they're going to test. And then they should be researching colleges. I am sending them and CCing all of you that in SCORE there is a suggested list that I've made, or am complementing what they've already got in SCORE with a few more suggestions. And there's no timeline on researching schools at this point. It's really over the next few months. But I am encouraging them, obviously, to look at the places they were already thinking about and that I've suggested, move things into the following column on SCORE that they might think they want to know more about. And SCORE uses the social media language of following a school. You can't put schools in the following column. I can't put schools in the following column. They have editorial control over that. So that's ultimately what I care about looking at. It says to me, this is what this child is actually, interested in, as opposed to what I've sort of, or you have foisted upon them. So they should be doing that. And then, of course, if there are places I've suggested they're not interested in, I don't have any emotional attachment to what I've suggested for them. I have told them it's fine to remove them, to just leave them in that column if they're not interested, that's fine. And then to be, starting to learn more about the places that they are following. So whether that's doing some virtual visits, a lot of colleges are still doing virtual tours and information sessions on Zoom. And one thing that's really nice about a lot of those is that they're able to get more specific. And so schools are doing things for students of color, for engineering students, for, artists and performers. So you can drill in a little bit more than just the generic session. But then, also getting to some campuses, if we are able to be doing travel and all the rest by spring break and summer, nothing beats standing in the middle of a campus and just getting a sense of the aesthetics there and how close is the, college town, what's around the campus, and really get a feel for that. So again, no real timeline for that, but really by this summer, I'm going to start pushing kids to be thinking about starting to pull things over into, well, I might apply here, I might apply there, and moving into that next stage of the process. So the next 6 months, be trying on these schools and doing some shopping. And as we move into February, know that I'm happy to meet with any of you. We can do a one-on-one Zoom if you'd like to meet without your child. We can do something together. We can do both. So just keep me posted on what you feel like your needs are. Obviously, I'm happy to answer quick emails here and there. And know that my meeting schedule is up for February. Oh, I meant to have a calendar link in the chat. But anyway, it's on the portal. Most of my emails have a link to my appointment schedule in my signature, and it's in the week ahead every Friday. So just feel free to sign up for something, and I'm happy to jump on Zoom and chat. And I'm almost done here, just to save the dates before we just get to your questions. So March 1st is going to be our annual financial aid conversation. The goal is to actually have it at school. We will allow you in the building because it should be, only 30 or 40 of you. And so typically I invite sophomore and junior parents to come to this. Mary Morrison, who some of you may have heard her presentation before, she was the director of financial aid at Stanford for 20 or 30 years. She's retired now, but she comes in and does both a very informative and amusing presentation, a lot around the FAFSA and around need-based aid and helping you understand what you may or may not qualify for and different parts of the form, why they're asking for different questions, and then touches on merit aid, outside scholarships, that kind of thing. If you've sat through her before and you don't want to do it again, great. I know some people are real Mary fans and happy to hear it twice. And if you haven't heard her before, it's a great just orientation to things. So that will be on March 1st, probably 7-ish. And typically we do it in the Beit Midrash, but we might be in the theater just to let folks spread out a little bit more and all the rest. And then the other date to have on your calendar far in advance is April 24th, which is a Sunday. That's the end of Passage break. It's the last day. So hopefully folks are back in town, but I understand if you're traveling that you might be using that as a travel day. But this program, it's called the Case Studies Program. And it is all of the independent schools in San Francisco. There's about 10 of us. This has been on hiatus for the last 2 years. We are hoping we'll be able to bring it back this spring. If for some reason we have to pivot and not do a sort of mass gathering, last year I was able to put together a case study program just for JCHS students that we did on Zoom with some college reps. But here's what it is and why it's helpful. Typically college reps come from, I don't know, 100 different colleges from around the country. And this is like a road show where they go to different parts of the Bay Area each week. They start in San Francisco. And basically you'd spend half of the program doing a mock admission committee. And so both parents and students have typically been invited to attend. You have 4 sort of fake common applications for different students. And you are in a classroom with, 15 maybe people and 2 college admission reps that are leading you through this. And they lead you through like a mock admission committee, and you review these applications together. You talk about things that stand out, things that might complicate the student's chances of admission. And they show you what it's like to make some admission decisions. You usually admit one of these students, maybe waitlist 2 of them, deny one of them. And uniformly, people who go through this leave saying that it was really helpful to get a little bit more insight into how some of these decisions are made. So put April 24th on your calendar. I will let you know if Omicron or whatever new variant has popped up derails us from that. But hopefully we might be able to pivot to something just for JCHS if we need to, but it's really helpful for insight. Okay, I'm going to stop talking there and see what your questions are. So feel free if you want to unmute, if you want to put things in the chat. Let me know what is on your mind about this part of the process. Yeah, Tamara.
So the first time around with my older son, in looking at schools and trying to determine if it would be a good fit for him, you tend to look at acceptance rates as just a way to see how the selectivity. And after you stare at that for a while, it starts to all become kind of a blur. And I just like got to the point where I wasn't really sure. Everything seemed kind of possible, I guess, in a way. And I ended up at some point starting to also look at the average freshman GPA just to have a broad sense of, it just almost felt more meaningful. But I've been reading as I'm now looking for my younger sons that it can be tricky to use that figure about what the average freshman GPA is for last year's incoming class, because it could lump in really selective programs. And then you've got this, kind of skewed number. And so I'm wondering, I mean, GPA does feel helpful because my kids can understand it, whereas they could be looking at like a school that accepts, only 10% of the kids. And they're like, well, I could probably do it. So I guess my question is, are there some schools that average GPA for the incoming freshman class from last year is more meaningful? And in particular, I'm curious about the UCs.
Yeah, so you're talking about the GPA that they sort of left high school with?
So most schools will publish somewhere the average GPA for last year's freshman class. So you get a sense whether or not your child could kind of fit.
Right. The thing that's really tricky about that is grade inflation, different grading systems. It can be a little apples and oranges, because if you think about what a certain GPA might mean at JCHS, doesn't mean the same thing as at Lowell, as at university, and there are some people are on a 10-point grading system, some are on the 100-point scale, some are on a 4-point scale like us. So when I read applications at Mount Holyoke, we actually didn't print an average GPA because we weren't sure it was helpful in terms of this broad context. Then you got to think about all the international students applying and how are they factoring, are things being converted, so Well, I so appreciate you trying to find something to hang your hat on, because that's a big tricky part of this process, is figuring out, like, do I actually have a shot of getting in? But if you're going to look at GPAs, I would take it with a grain of salt. I think the most useful thing with GPAs is looking in score at the scattergrams for JCHS applicant history, because then you're doing apples to apples. And so on every college and score, when you click on the tile in someone's link, a little box opens up and there's a blue highlighted thing that says view scattergram. And if there's any applicant history, and some of the smaller liberal arts colleges, this can be touch and go, because we might only have like one application a year. And I try and restrict the data you can see, since we're such a small school. If there's fewer than 5 applications in the last few years, nothing's going to pop up, because I don't want you to be able to, oh, I know that person applied there and that must be their SAT score. But if there's more than 5 applications, you should get some data. The UCs, really commonly applied to schools, places with robust Jewish population should have a lot of data. And that GPA for, who was admitted, who was denied, who was waitlisted, is always going to be the cumulative from the end of junior year. So we don't update it to final GPAs, because that's not what a student was admitted on, right? They were admitted on their year-long and cumulative at the end of junior year. So your kids will have that data point come June, and then they're able to look kind of apples to apples. Because, a place like Berkeley, the average GPA for a JCHS student to be admitted is going to be like a 4.2 or a 4.3. It's going to be pretty high, right? Where Oregon, it might be like a 3.0. And but that's JCHS specific. And so that, I think it's more useful than looking at other schools. Does that help?
Yeah, very helpful. That's a good
And
one.
also know, everyone who hasn't done this before, this summer I will start tagging your kids' lists with whether I think something is a reach or a possible or a likely, because it's a little bit more than just that admit rate. It's also like, what's their curriculum? Do they have APs or not? And I'm thinking about things like their leadership and, some of those other more intangible things that are going to come up as either a benefit or a question of like, why didn't they do more? So I'm looking at it contextually beyond just the GPAs and test scores. So that'll be coming over the summer. And I think we've got some stuff in chat. So hang on a second, Paul, let me, or Lev, let me see if I've got some questions to answer here. Wondering if you can look at European or Canadian schools. Absolutely. One thing folks should know about schools like in the UK, Canadian schools, they rely a lot more on testing. And so that just right from the get-go can be either a barrier for your student or exciting, if they're a good test taker. So one of the benefits to looking at schools in Europe and in Canada is that they're more transparent with this whole question of, can I get in or not, which is so great. They are much more, if you're looking at doing history, you should have, some AP scores in humanities classes of a certain range or higher. You should have an SAT score of this or higher. You're eligible for the program, then you're probably going to get in. So it's pretty straightforward, but you do have to test. And we found a real issue with that last year in particular, because there were a number of schools in the UK who just didn't drop their testing requirement. And we literally kids could not test here in the Bay Area. That was happening in other parts of the country where they maybe cared less about COVID. They were keeping some testing centers open, but there was a hard stop for a lot of kids trying to apply last year outside of the country. Things are a little better this year, both in terms of the ability to test, and some schools have given a little bit more flexibility. But yeah, that's what I'll say briefly about UK and Canadian stuff. If your students are looking there, happy to help with that. There's a different kind of set of applications and procedures, deadlines, all of that. But in some ways, it can be a slightly easier process. It's a little more streamlined and predictable. And then Allison asks, I have a question about early decision. Do you think it makes the most sense to tour visit the reach schools first to help narrow down which school you might apply as early decision? Excellent question. Was just talking with a student about this yesterday. So a couple of things on that, just to make sure everybody understands terminology. Early applications, you often have some strategic advantage by applying early. There's two different kinds. Early action isn't binding. You're submitting an application early. You find out early, which often means by winter break, but this year we're finding some places are notifying this month, but it's still earlier than March or April. So early action, I think, is great because you get a yes often before winter break. There's a nice ego boost. It helps colleges spread out their work over a greater number of months. Early decision is typically something that some of the most highly selective schools will engage in. And this is a commitment. It is binding. So like kid signs a thing, you sign a thing, I sign a thing saying we all acknowledge that if the student gets into this school, they will go. Now, the caveat exception to that can be if the financial aid just doesn't match up. They will often release you from the contract. But the idea is that this is your first choice, and if you get it, you're going to go. So this is a time where people start to think, well, obviously I want to apply somewhere early decision. It's just a question of where. And I will urge you to not put the cart before the horse. That can be a sort of smart thing, and some, there's some logic to it because early decision admit rates tend to be higher than some of those really low regular decision admit rates. Colleges, this is advantages them, right? They admit a student, they know that student is coming. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Where regular decisions, some places have to admit 3 students to get 1 student to come, right? And if they want to keep these admit rates really low and up their US News and World Report ranking, there is some gamification going on here, right? So I understand the urge to think like, let's find a first choice and apply early decision, but I would really want you to pull the reins on that a little bit just to make sure that you are authentically finding a place that it would be a good match for your child and where they would be happy, because we don't want them to just be bouncing back to me next year with the request for a transfer application, right? So do this sort of slowly and methodically. So yes, visiting some of these places earlier on. So if you're thinking, I'm looking at University of Chicago or Brown is the ideal, some of these places with really low admit rates, yes, visiting sooner rather than later would let you know if this might be a place that they are really feeling excited about. But if you're going to make a trip to the East Coast, if you're going to make a trip to Chicago, I would urge you to not only see those reach schools, because the chances of admission are quite small. So when you see a 10% admit rate, I think as Tara had said earlier, often the child goes to, well, that means I have a chance. But it's sort of like, if there's a 90% chance of rain, are you going to leave your umbrella at home? Right? There's like, so you gotta think about like, you're gonna visit Chicago, also visit Lake Forest or somewhere with a broader admit rate. Like use some of that time when you're traveling to offset some of that a little bit. Because what I find is the absolute hardest thing about this process is getting kids to get excited about schools that are possibles and likelies. And those may be their options at the end of the day. Like we need to be realistic about that. So I want them to apply to these highly selective places. Some kids get into these highly selective places, but don't make the trip about just that, if that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to pause in the chat for a second because Lev has been so patient. What was your question, Lev?
Well, I want to make 2 quick comments and then I have a question. My 2 quick comments are that as someone who just recently went through this with my oldest, I think doing an early decision, at least from my sense, particularly with private schools, puts you at a disadvantage in terms of bargaining on the financial aid. So, I mean, we certainly had the experience where I had to tell my oldest daughter, if you get in, you still can't go unless you happen to be one of the people who gets one of those full ride scholarships. So if finances are an issue, you have to think about that, because if your early decision, they kind of got you. They don't have to
can't weigh offers between different schools, right?
So that's number one. I had some other comment, but I don't remember what it was, so I'll just ask my question. So this my second oldest daughter is dealing with an issue my first did not, which is now there's test blind schools, and she is adamant that she does not want to take the SAT, and she doesn't need to because it's test blind. And I don't have a good informed way of explaining to her, these are the schools you're cutting off from your possibilities if you don't take the standardized tests. And I'm wondering, I actually sent you an email about setting up a meeting with you and her about it, but I'm wondering if there's some website that folks might be able to look at, or some way of getting a sense of the landscape of, if that's the route you take, this is what you're cutting off in terms of your possibilities.
Excellent point and question. And I know she and I are meeting next week, so we will also have a bit of a conversation about this. But it'd be amazing if there were a website right now that listed all of that. And the fact of the matter is that that data is still incoming for your class. I was on a Zoom yesterday with a bunch of deans and VPs of admission from New York City, highly selective schools. So it was like Columbia and Barnard and NYU and Fordham, a bunch of places. And, for example, NYU has not made an announcement yet about next year and said, we're still processing some applications. We should have something up on our website in a couple of weeks. So other places several months ago said the class of 2023 is going to have a totally test optional, situation with us, or we've decided to be test wine, but it's still just kaleidoscope of options right now. So we don't have all the information, but I can make an educated guess by some of the places students are looking at now, or that I think are going to be options for them, whether we need to keep the broadest number of doors open or not. For example, there are some kids and families who really are focused on UCs and CSUs and being in state and having that lower financial commitment and all the rest. They're now test blind, like forever. So I'm totally comfortable putting tests off the table for those kids. There are some folks that, whether it's their more complex learning profile or whatnot, standardized tests, even if they went through the grind of trying to prep for it and take them, we're probably not going to submit them anyway, because they are, low test takers. So why do all of that? Let them focus on their academic work and keeping that GPA strong, and that's going to be a better data point. So I'm really trying to counsel student by student based on their aspirations, their background and bandwidth for this. And then of course, we've got some like really naturally great test takers. And it's like, yeah, if you can get that seat, let's go get that super high score. And that's just going to help complement things. So
that I remember my comment, and that was very helpful, but
okay.
I'd love to meet with you. There was a TED Talk that you shared with us that was presented before Google, where the point was that the data shows that folks who finish in the top 5% of their colleges, no matter what college it is, are enormously more successful than those that don't, regardless of the type of college. And it definitely gave us a lot of emotional comfort that as you're going through, and she and my daughter would get into maybe not her dream school, but schools that she could get comfortable with if she didn't get into the dream schools, that, oh, well, she could thrive there and enjoy the experience and finish, aim to finish in the top 5 and top 5%, that it wasn't all about getting into the hardest school to get into. Yeah. And I would definitely recommend sharing that with folks, even before they pick their schools, because it gives them comfort that you can pick a school where you just actually think you'd really enjoy your experience.
Yeah. Thanks.
Even if it might not be the most prestigious.
Yeah, I will put a link to that when I send the video out from this. So it's a Malcolm Gladwell talk that he did at Google, highly data informed, and is just the theme is sort of like, why are we as humans, attracted to elite institutions and often places that don't want us? And he's like, this is irrational, and gives some data on why, but he's very human about it and saying like, here I am talking at Google. Are they paying me for this? No. Did I want to like talk at Google? Sure did. So here I am, so it's a great, I think, kind of humorous conversation, but it's about college in particular, as Lev said. So he'll talk about some kids from Harvard and some kids from a place that isn't Harvard. So yeah, I'll send that link out. Okay, we got a lot of stuff in chat, so I'm going to keep reading questions here. I'm wondering if somewhere there's a de-identified list of former JCHS students and which colleges they were accepted to. There sure is. So if you go to the JCHS website, like not the portal, but the actual, forward public facing website and click on college advising, you'll see there's a link for college acceptances, and it's got the last 5 years worth of data. So it's everywhere anyone was accepted over the last 5 years. And then in bold, there where students chose to enroll. So that just gives you, sort of a broad picture of things. And we put that up there, obviously, for admission reasons. People looking at JCHS get a sense of all the places that our kids are headed. Question about, is there any kind of GPA calculator out there that can toggle between what different schools consider? Not so much, because every school is considering things differently. So for example, some colleges might pull out religious classes from GPAs. They might recalculate the GPA to not have JS courses, or if it's a Catholic school, other religious courses. Some people strip out arts classes, thinking that that's not a core academic subject. Some will take the GPA the school gives them at face value. So again, it's one of these maddening things with college admission where it depends based on, which school you're thinking about. For students considering a gap year, is it best? Excellent question. This process now of the college acceptance, and they will often let you defer, so you've got your spot saved, then to try and go through the application process when you're on your gap year or after, it can kind of just delay things. While they are at JCHS, they have the support of faculty, they have support from me, doing things like getting the recommendation letters on file, and all of that is really useful while it's part of the peer culture. And almost every private school allows deferral for a year once you're admitted. Most public schools do. We oftentimes are not able to get that from a CSU. So I had a student last year who was thinking maybe a gap year, and then she got into Cal Poly, which was her top choice. Cal Poly was not going to allow a deferral. And so she said, you know what, I'm just going to go, and I can think about studying abroad or, doing something more international while I'm a student. The UCs have language on their website that they don't allow gap years. But they also in the fine print say that if you're doing something religious or military, that they will allow it on case-by-case basis. And, lucky for us, they consider anything in Israel, it seems, religious. So you don't have to be going to a seminary necessarily to get that. Yes, if you are, trying to do, search and rescue in Alaska, they're probably not going to allow for that. But for the students that are thinking about programs that might be in Israel, that has been the loophole. So we've got, the last couple of years, kids that are, going to UCLA or Santa Cruz or Davis or other places that have been able to do a gap year, no problem. So again, we'll talk about your family's personal situation, but I would do the college process now until we get to a moment where it makes sense to stop for whatever reason. And sometimes that's about, I know I want to be a lone soldier in the IDF. And when kids get out of the IDF or sometimes get off their gap year, they come back to me and I'm happy to help them. So we do their college process, 3 years down the road or whatnot. So that know that me or whoever is in my position, I won't work at JCHS forever, is happy to receive alumni and help them navigate whatever point they're at. I feel like I saw maybe, Patty, did you have a question?
Thanks. If you could go back to sort of Lev's question when you were talking about for kids that do not test well, and it would be an enormous investment in time with very unlikely payoff. Mm-hmm. So are you saying that recommending that they not go that route?
Yeah, which gets me a little pit in my stomach because it's never been something in my 20-some years in this career I've been able to say, but I feel pretty confident that at least for your class going into this next year, the vast majority are still going to be test optional, and that, an increasing number, small but mighty number like the UCs are actually pulling the trigger on test blind. So, and, to see Harvard recently say that they are going to just be test optional, it has to start with the folks at the top of the food chain, right? And so the fact that they did that, I do think the trickle effect of this policy shift sticking at some of the more selective places broadly, I think it's a good sign. But to Leb's question, I can tell you right now that we are still in a place where, and here's what I should say, it's not just like the director of admissions decision at an individual school, whether they take the SAT or the ACT. Often the board of trustees at the school weighs in, the president has an opinion, sometimes the state legislature. And so, as is the case in Florida and Georgia, they never went test optional because it is a state legislature decision for the public schools, whether or not the SAT and the ACT are required. And they said, we're pandemic or no, so they have just required kids to test. So if your student is just set on the University of Florida, then they don't have an option. But most of our kids are not set on the University of Florida. And Georgetown. Georgetown weirdly is obsessed with testing. They've always been obsessed with testing. And so if your child is intent on Georgetown, they're going to need to have a score, and it's also going to need to be really, really high. So beyond those, that I'm aware of right now, all bets are off for everything else. And so that's where having these conversations, one-on-one with your kids to think about what are they thinking, what are they aspiring to, what's their potential career path. Also, the writers, the artists, all those folks, it's also less important that they've got a bunch of data points. So does that help? Great. All right, I'm going to get back to the chat box here for a second. Yeah, testing dates, really, really hard to find. So yeah, if things are really booked up right now for ACT or SAT, you might be stuck right now. I will say it's January still. And as people are seeing how Omicron is unfolding, at this point last year, we found that ACT in particular, SAT, the College Board wasn't doing this as much, but ACT started opening more spots by offering these mass testing sites at airports or at hotels near the airport. So they were, having ballrooms and stuff sort of opened up for testing. They were much better about trying to respond to the demand situation. College Board seemed to just be like, sorry. Keep in mind, there are Sunday test date options. Those may be getting booked up as well. But if you honor Shabbat, you absolutely can test on a Sunday. Know that you will likely need a letter from Rabbi Rubin, which I can quickly and easily provide to you via email to upload when you're registering for a Sunday date. But that might be a place where there's a little bit more wiggle room. If you're finding yourself like the closest test date is Reno, I'm going to encourage you for us to have another conversation about whether it makes sense for you to actually be like crossing state lines to take the test. Last year, we had some students that were choosing to do that. There were some folks that got on planes to go take the SAT or the ACT. Not a big fan of going to those extremes. And this is yet another piece of the inequity stuff around testing. Prior to the pandemic, many places were moving test optional because there are just a lot of reasons why your family income correlates with high test scores. And that's a problem for colleges in terms of trying to be equitable with admission decisions. So keep me posted on what you're finding with the testing situation, and drop me an email if you're feeling really stuck and all of that. Okay, I have a question about recommend any books that would be a good reference for colleges, and preference for actual physical books to online materials. Oh, and folks have said, just seeing this in the chat, that I'm freezing. Are you able to hear me? Are things okay? All right, I rebooted my internet right before this just to try and be sure that wouldn't happen, but 2022, still have technical issues. Resources, my favorite paper resource to learn a bit about colleges is the FIS Guide to Colleges, the big green book, looks like an old school phone book. Do not let the size of it daunt you, because each college description is only like 2 pages. It's pretty quick reading. But the information there is somewhat of the folks that work for the FIS Guide. It is also questionnaires that they give out to students and faculty. It's typically not like monitored by the admission office, so you're going to get a little bit more honest data there. It's not the sales job that you might get from admission. it's important to hear the sales job, but to also get the non-sales job. And one thing I love about the FIS guide is the overlaps box for each college. So if you're reading about the University of Montana and you really like what you're hearing about Montana, there's a little box that says overlaps. It's going to tell you like the 5 schools kids also apply to if they're looking at the University of Montana. So you can kind of start going down a rabbit hole there of like-minded schools. And I would also just say generally for navigating the college search, I really like the book, The College Conversation. I think that takes you sort of methodically through the process and things to really think about. And that's by the, I think former now VP of admission at Penn and Eric Furta, and then Jacques Steinberg, who ran the education section of the New York Times for like 25 years. So really highly informed folks. Question about if a child has mediocre test result but top grades, should they apply without test scores? Absolutely, they should. And we've been making a lot of choices around that this year and last year. I think you can look at sort of the middle 50% of a college's admitted student test score ranges. And if the scores are falling outside of that and the school's test optional, man, just leave them out. Just leave them out. And the scores have obviously been de-emphasized as we've moved into this test optional world. But certainly if the transcript is stronger, and then I would presume, you know, the writing, the recommendations, the activities, you know, all of that is maybe making a stronger case than adding that particular data point in. So know that I'm happy to sit down with students. We do this all the time. This is my October where we're like, okay, so here's the list. Here's where it looks like I froze for a second. So I'll just, I'll say that, now I've forgotten what I was just saying. Oh, we will look at the test score ranges and go school by school. The highly selective places, leaving them out will make sense. Some of the possible or likely schools, it might make sense to include them. You might be, you know, in the range for them. So yeah, we take it on a case by case basis. Question about Israeli schools as opposed to EU and Canada. And Israeli schools, again, it's a much easier process. Their deadlines tend to be in the spring. So you can kind of do some US schools if you want, and then submit those applications later on and see what happens. They've been pretty open to test optional. And I think I just had heard from 1 or 2 schools that they were staying test optional for next year. We do have a couple of JCHS alums that I could connect folks with at some different schools in Israel. Yeah, it's just, it's an easier process, again, in terms of both what's required of you and whether you need testing and all the rest. And it's more predictable. I think they're not on the whole really highly selective places. So there's less anxiety with applying. So definitely a good option. Are you able or have you screened for schools that have hateful rhetoric, right? Groups on campus that are anti-Zionist, yeah, active BDS kind of stuff. Yes, I tend to stay sort of aware generally about where there might be some hot spots. I think writ large, the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a little less of that overall, which is nice to see. But yes, I do. And certainly students and families that are vocal about that, I'm paying extra attention to, but all of our students, I'm going to steer away from places that are going to feel inhospitable. What else can I say about that? I would keep an eye on news reports, you know, as is the case with racist incidents or homophobic incidents. Colleges generally are going to be a microcosm of the rest of the country, right? So you can't avoid some of these things popping up, and sometimes it's coming from outside the campus community. What I try to pay attention to is what the response is from the leadership, from the student body. That's going to give you really a sense of how seriously they take these things, how quick they react, what does the reaction look like. So pay attention to leadership responses.
Hi, I do have a question. I
Yeah,
want to talk
go
about
for
this.
it.
I have older kids
Mhm,
and I'm very, very aware of what's going on, extremely aware.
mhm,
So I believe it's getting worse. I follow a lot of this stuff.
mhm.
What I want to know is, have you screened into these schools, if you don't mind? about allowing speakers from CARE, allowing speakers like Sorsar.
Mhm.
It's different than Black racism. It's when the schools actually condone this
Mm,
rhetoric against Israel and the Jewish
yeah,
people. And that's what I want to understand. Like
right.
how, like to what extent, like Bard, I think you mentioned before, I'm pretty sure when we visited there, they had all kinds of stuff up that was very uncomfortable.
Right.
So I just don't know, like, do you talk to one administrator or what department do you talk to kind of get a good sense?
Yeah.
I screen my older daughter's schools, but I want to screen at a whole new level now. And I'm
Mhm.
trying to find out what departments I would talk to get a best sense of that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think going straight to the Jewish organizations, of course, and if there aren't any Jewish organizations, then that's also going to be your first heads up. But looking for the Hillel, looking at Chabad, talking to a rabbi on campus, the head of any Jewish youth groups, to see what their experience and their take has been on things. And if it's hard to find those people, then that also might be a red flag. But Hillel.org is going to have pretty updated contact information for folks on various campuses. So you can definitely start there. And they also have some useful data just about like percentage of Jews on campus and often some narrative about the group on campus, if it's at all, like the Hillel group, if it's at all active. So that's where I would start.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Let me see if I've missed anything else. Oh, can kids skip the writing portion of standardized testing? They sure can, because you know what? It doesn't exist anymore for the SAT. And the ACT, I think I don't know that there's any schools that are requiring it anymore. So skip the writing portion of the test if it's still an option somewhere. Unless, one caveat, if your student has testing accommodations, something like being able to bubble things in or use a laptop or whatnot, that lets them be able to test at JCHS if they're doing the writing portion. If they're not doing the writing portion, then you're in with the rest of folks who may be having trouble finding testing seats. So if you've got testing accommodations, you're going to take the test. It's the ACT. And if you choose to access the writing section, then you can do it at JCHS proctored by Ms. Krieger. So if you suffer through the writing section, knowing that folks are not really going to take it seriously, it could be a little easier to get a test date. Everybody else, skip the writing section. All right, we got about 10 minutes left. Let's just see. Okay, we've got some more stuff. Excellent. Yeah. Good. And as we keep having these meetings once a month, let's all bring what we're learning about individual campuses at this moment and feedback and incidents that are happening. Absolutely. So any other questions? We do not have to run till 9 if we're tapped out for this morning. We've covered a lot of ground. You are so welcome, everyone. I enjoy seeing faces, getting to know who all of you are. It's so helpful that you're labeled too, your names. So I'm learning who everyone is. Yes, Patty.
Hi. Is there an effective way to search by universities that have like learning support, or I haven't figured that out yet?
Yeah. So again, I have some very large books in my office. They look like phone books that you're welcome to borrow. I can send home with your child, or you can get on Amazon. But I think there's a good one from Princeton Review, and then yeah, if you just Google on colleges for students with learning differences, you will find some of that. And there is a lot on the web at this point where you can, and I would check some reputable sources would be like Niche. They're going to have, so NICHE, they do some college grading generally, but they're also going to be able to let you filter on things like learning support. College Board, I think their Big Future website, don't love the College Board, but Big Future is their search function on colleges, and and that's also going to have really up-to-date data. And if I know that, and as I'm meeting with your kids, I'm definitely looking at learning plans for Ms. Krieger and all the rest, and aware of who has certain diagnoses and accommodations and needs support. So I am doing that as an initial filter on some of the schools I'm recommending. So generally, smaller schools are going to have a little bit more support, but there are some places like University of Arizona. It's one of the biggest colleges in the country, but their SALT center is top notch for student support, providing some scaffolding and all the rest. Mr. Shapiro's daughter, Talia, actually goes there and works with the SALT Center. He does our dining services. So if you have questions about the SALT program in particular, I think she's in her junior year and has found it to be so amazingly helpful. So it depends. There are some of these places, even if they're gigantic, that may do that work really well. So happy to help you navigate that individually too. Yeah, Stephen.
The initial colleges that you suggested to our kids, was that just from a casual conversation with them, or was that a more kind of nuanced list that you offered to them?
It is a more nuanced list, in so much as I've got, a certain amount of data at this point, and it is a launching ground for them to get started. So I fully expect that they're going to reject some of those. You may reject some of those, that there will be other ones that they add, but I also think that there'll be a couple in there that might stick. So it is based on where I'm seeing their academic profile. And I'm trying to suggest some things that are going to be in a range from the stretch to the more likely, what they have thought they might be interested in academically at this point. And if they're undecided, places that are good for kids that are trying to explore a little bit. And then learning support, whether it's certain parts of the country they want to be in, whether they need a smaller community or they're really ready to be anonymous financially, who might offer some merit aid if it's a private school versus, a CSU that's going to be the lowest tuition. So I am running it through a couple of filters. The Jewish filter is obviously always one as well. But it's by no means like I'm not super close with your children at this point.
Sure.
So I expect that there's going to be some pivoting from that as well. So
Great.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Great. Anything else? 7 minutes to go. I'm getting thank yous. Thank you guys. I love having a little time to just answer all the questions. Anything else? Well, I will let you know what's coming up next. Again, we'll have this set up top March 1st, have a financial aid session on campus, hopefully. April 24th, hopefully we'll do this mock admission committee that you all are welcome, as well as your kids, to participate in. My calendar is up. There's a Google appointment calendar. It's half-an-hour slots. I can do Zoom. I can do in person. We can do both if it's your kids' study hall and we get you on Zoom and sit together in my office. February is, a very open month for me, delightfully. So my schedule right now is sort of wide open if you want to have some time to chat. And I just started to schedule with junior English teachers when I will be popping into English classes. This is going to be towards the end of the semester, but I'll just remind you that your students will do a draft, a first run at a common application essay. Almost everyone applies to a common application school. Not everybody, but so we do this as a universal process. And so they will finish the year having started to think about how to do some of this first person college writing. So I will get to Miss Cornelius's classes first. I think that's like the end of April or early May. And then Miss Fouts' classes will be after the AP exam. So anything else? Great. Well, we'll call it for today. I will send out this recording in a few days when Mr. McDonald gets to it, and I will hopefully see you on email, on Zoom, and doing this again next month. So have a good Thursday.